primitive ventricle, 4. the bulbus cordis, and 5. the truncus arteriosus. The constriction between the atrium and ventricle constitutes the arterial canal and indicates the site of the future atrioventricular valves. The sinus venosus is at first situated in the septum transversum, a layer of mesoderm in which the liver and the central tendon of the diaphragm are developed, behind the primitive atrium, and is formed by the union of the vitelline veins. The veins or ducts of Cuvier from the body of the embryo and the umbilical veins from the placenta subsequently open into it. The sinus is at first transversely and opens by a median aperture into the primitive atrium. Soon, however, it assumes an oblique position and becomes crescentic in form. Its right half or horn increases more rapidly than the left, and the opening into the atrium now communicates with the right portion of the atrial cavity. The right horn and transverse portion of the sinus ultimately become incorporated with and form a part of the adult right atrium, the line of union between it and the auricula being indicated in the interior of the atrium by a vertical crest, the crista terminalis of His. The left horn, which ultimately receives only the left duct of Cuvier, persists as the coronary sinus. The vitelline and umbilical veins are soon replaced by a single vessel, the inferior vena cava, and the three veins, inferior vena cava and right and left Cuvierian ducts, open into the dorsal aspect of the atrium by a common slit-like aperture. The upper part of this aperture represents the opening of the permanent superior vena cava, the lower that of the inferior vena cava, and the intermediate part the orifice of the coronary sinus. The slit-like aperture lies obliquely and is guarded by two halves, the right and left venous valves. Above the opening these unite with each other and are continuous with the fold, named the septum spurium. Below the opening they fuse to form a triangular thickening, the spina vestibuli. The right venous valve is retained. A small septum, the sinus septum, grows from the posterior wall of the sinus venosus, diffused with the valve, and divided into two parts, an upper, the valve of the inferior vena cava, and a lower, the valve of the coronary sinus. The extreme upper portion of the right venous valve, together with the septum spurium, form the crista terminalis already mentioned. The upper and middle thirds of the left venous valve disappear. The lower third is continued into the spina vestibuli, and later fuses with the septum secundum of the atria, and takes part in the formation of the limbus fossae of Vallis. The atrial canal is at first a short straight tube connecting the atrial with the ventricular portion of the heart, but its growth is relatively slow, and it becomes overlapped by the atria and ventricles, so that its position on the surface of the heart is indicated only by an annular constriction. Its lumen is reduced to a transverse slit, and two thickenings appear, one on its dorsal and another on its ventral wall, or endocardial cushions, as they are termed, project into the canal, and, meeting in the middle-line, unite to form the septum intermedium, which divides the canal into two channels, the future right and left atrioventricular orifices. The primitive atrium grows rapidly and partially encircles the bulbus cordis. The groove against which the bulbus cordis lies is the first indication of a division into right and left atria. The cavity of the primitive atrium becomes subdivided into right and left chambers by a septum, the septum primum, which grows downward into the cavity. For a time the atria communicate with each other by an opening, the ostium primum of Born, below the free margin of the septum. This opening is closed by the union of the septum primum with the septum intermedium, and the communication between the atria is re-established through an opening which is developed in the upper part of the septum primum. This opening is known as a foramen ovale, ostium secundum of Born, and persists until birth. A second septum, the septum secundum, semilunar in shape, grows downward from the upper wall of the atrium, immediately to the right of the primary septum and foramen ovale. Shortly after birth it fuses with the primary septum, and by this means the foramen ovale is closed. But sometimes the fusion is incomplete, and the upper part of the foramen remains patent. The limbus fossae ovalis denotes the free margin of the septum secundum. Issuing from each lung is a pair of pulmonary veins. Each pair unites to form a single vessel, and these in turn join in a common trunk which opens into the left atrium. Subsequently, the common trunk and the two vessels forming it expand and form the vestibule or greater part of the atrium, the expansion reaching as far as the openings of the four vessels, so that in the adult all four veins open separately into the left atrium. The primitive ventricle becomes divided by a septum, the septum inferius or ventricular septum, which grows upward from the lower part of the ventricle, its position being indicated on the surface of the heart by a furrow. Its dorsal part increases more rapidly than its ventral portion, and fuses with the dorsal part of the septum intermedium. For a time an interventricular foramen exists above its ventral portion, but this foramen is ultimately closed by the fusion of the aortic septum with the ventricular septum. When the heart assumes its S-shaped form, the bulbus cordis lies ventral to and in front of the primitive ventricle. The adjacent walls of the bulbus cordis and ventricle approximate, fuse, and finally disappear, and the bulbus cordis now communicates freely with the right ventricle, while the junction of the bulbus with the truncus arteriosus is brought directly ventral to and applied to the atrial canal. By the upgrowth of the ventricular septum, the bulbus cordis is in great measure separated from the left ventricle, but remains an integral part of the right ventricle, of which it forms the infundibulum. The truncus arteriosus and bulbus cordis are divided by the aortic septum. This makes its appearance in three portions. 1. Two distal ridge-like thickenings project into the lumen of the tube. These increase in size and ultimately meet and fuse to form a septum, which takes a spiral course toward the proximal end of the truncus arteriosus. It divides the distal part of the truncus into two vessels, the aorta and pulmonary artery, which lie side by side above, but near the heart. The pulmonary artery is in front of the aorta. 2. 4 endocardial cushions appear in the proximal part of the truncus arteriosus in the region of the future semilunar valves. The manner in which these are related to the aortic septum is described below. 3. 2 endocardial thickenings, anterior and posterior, develop in the bulbus cordis and unite to form a short septum. This joins above with the aortic septum and below with the ventricular septum. The septum grows down into the ventricle as an oblique partition, which ultimately blends with the ventricular septum in such a way as to bring the bulbus cordis into communication with the pulmonary artery, and through the latter with the sixth pair of aortic arches, while the left ventricle is brought into continuity with the aorta, which communicates with the remaining aortic arches. End of section 3.